If you take anything from this video, it's to have grace with yourself, it's to remember that it is a marathon, not a sprint. Understand what a first draft is and what it means to you. It's helping you write further versions of the story. Hello and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be sharing some questions that I asked myself in the early stages of drafting a novel. Now these are questions I've collected over the years while drafting 2 manuscripts and that I'm using at the moment to draft my dark academia fantasy novel. Obviously writing advice is not one size fits all, so feel free to take some of the questions to use them as a jumping off point or to use them in their entirety and add ones or adapt them, do whatever you like with them. These work for me for now and I can't promise they won't change in the future, but I just thought I would share them because I think they have been so useful for drafting this book. If you are new here, I'm Katie. I am a writer currently working on a dark academia fantasy novel. So the first questions I have are very broad. These are for the very early stages when you are super excited about the idea. If you're not in those early stages, maybe you're a little bit further into it, you can still use these. I think they're a really good way of reinvigorating yourself. If you are a bit stuck, if you need that energy boost, if you need a reminder of why you're writing this book in the first place, I think these are perfect. I've definitely used them for this in the past and yeah, they're great. So the first question is, why this story? Now it could be, if you are a speculative fiction writer especially, that you have just a really cool idea. It could be sci-fi, it could be horror, it could be a fantasy concept that you are really excited about. Doesn't matter what it is, if you think it's cool and you're excited about it, brain dump all of that idea onto a piece of paper and just go crazy. If you only have like the vague idea fleshed out and you need to do some research, write those questions down, write down those things that you need to do. Just get it all in one place and put it away, because it will be really helpful to read later on when you are stuck. If you're stuck now, this is just going to be a great exercise for you, but later on down the line when you're wondering, why did I want to write this story, what was cool about it, what like made me excited about it in the first place, you can go back and read that document. I do think the looser and the messier the better, because there's something that captures that energy that you have that is going to be the thing that gets you excited later on. Now the other aspect to this question is not just why this story, but why are you writing this story? Why do you want to write this story? Do you have a personal connection to it? Do you have a specific perspective that you want to see in that genre or on that topic? For example, I'm currently writing a dark academia novel. I don't have a very academic background and I have very specific feelings and a specific perspective on academic life that I do want to get across, but originally my idea was just something cool that I thought could exist in that dark academia setting. So I've kind of got a document with brain dump ideas of the fantasy elements, of the reasons I want to write this book, that's kind of like a mission statement, and the idea has come from melding those two things together. I think this is really good for getting your basic ideas for your plot down, but also your personal connection that ends up relating into character and into their development, their problems that they face, obstacles that they face, and also your theme. So a lot of this can be rooted back to that, and I think when you have that basic thing of why did I want to write this story, and if you get lost on the way, you can always find your way back to that and it will help you make decisions later on, or at least that's what I found. If you are struggling with your personal connection to the story, especially at this stage, it's useful to have a look at what you're thinking about in your daily life. For example, climate change is a constant presence in our lives, it's in the news all the time, everybody has an opinion about it, it's quite divisive, and it's also something that's difficult to talk about with other people, you know, like anything political is too. But it's probably something that you care deeply about. There's probably an aspect to the news, to the political climate that you really care about. I'm not saying you have to make a political novel, but that really shows you what you care about, and it shows you what you could be writing about from a place of passion and a place of natural interest and a place that you can just really go for it and have some real personal connection to the subject matter. I can think of 2 fantasy novels that I really love that tackle kind of climate change in very different ways, and that is Fire of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, in which all of the characters face one big global fantasy problem that does have kind of a bit of a thematic feel for climate change. I mean, the other is probably any dystopian book that you've ever read, but the other that I'm thinking of is the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which has a very post-apocalyptic, can't say that word, apocalyptic. There you go. Let's just
apocalyptic.
Anyway, this might all be not very relevant to you, but I do think if you have a personal connection to the story, however small that might be, it can definitely help when you get stuck later, or you think, what is the point of this story? What is the theme? What am I trying to, you know, learn about and discover what I think about? Because even the most plot-driven book will have that kind of element of a bit of reflection on what our lives are, what is going on. Maybe that's me just taking things a little bit too far, but I do think it's important. Now, the next question is, whose story is this? You might have a main character in mind at this stage, but if you don't, this is your chance to kind of think about, yes, I've got this concept, how can I bring people into this? Like, what characters are going to be grappling with this? Who's going to be involved in this? Now, the next question is, whose story is this? Now, you might have a main character in mind, or maybe multiple main characters. I would say that the most important question you can be asking yourself is, why this character for this story? In what way does the story belong to them? In what way does the story matter to them? And this is a question that is going to give you the foundation for answering some of the questions I've got later that are more granular to do with character and plot and story. So again, brain dumping everything that you think about on a page, and it could be anything character related. What I really want you to be thinking about is, who does this story belong to? So this next question is one that is super easy to just skip over or just assume that you know the answer. I would really recommend slowing down and testing out a few different alternate directions that you could go in. So the question is, how is this story being told? Now, I have made decisions for my story based on lots of tests that I've done, and I've chosen the direction I'm going in because it has some real applications for the story, and I think it adds depth and it helps me explore the story in more interesting ways. So I'm telling this dark academia fantasy novel in a retrospective point of view, and it's first person. So that means my narrator is the main character and she is telling the story looking back many, many years ago. And then I also have my main character who is the same person as the narrator, but they're much younger and they are experiencing the events as they unfold. So I have a very firm understanding of who my main character is and who my narrator is, and they're very different, and quite often you will find that they are very different unless you're writing something that is in present tense, first person, and it is told by the person as they're experiencing it. And you're gonna have to have, I think, quite strong reasons for that. It's quite typical in something like a YA novel, and genre expectations, age category expectations is a very valid reason for that. Obviously I've made a choice, which means you know at least the character survives, so if you don't want to ruin that tension, then maybe don't go with that option. There are so many different options here to do with who your narrator is and where they stand in terms of the events that are unfolding. And that's the way I like to think about it, because I think the narrator is your voice for the story. It's your authorial voice. It's how you are telling the story. It's how you're presenting it. And who that person is, even if they are an omniscient, not named narrator who is very removed from the events, but maybe, you know, they can pop into people's heads and hear their thoughts as the events are happening, and they can reflect on things, and they can give you information that the characters don't have access to. So even something as removed as that is going to be a conscious choice on your behalf because of what it will grant you in terms of how you can tell the story. That was quite a muddied explanation, and there are definitely amazing resources out there in terms of how to choose your tense, point of view, and your narration style. I would recommend going to look for those. I think I'm going to pop a couple that I like in the description, but it's definitely something you can ask yourself. And my only advice really is to not always take your first instinct as the right way of going about it. Definitely try other things. If you think you're a writer that would never use third person, just try it anyway. Third person, practicing it for me for this book, wasn't the right choice in the end, but I do think that it helped show me how I could write third person in the future, and it's given me ideas for books that I could write in third person. And yeah, it was really exciting and really different for my writing craft. So I do recommend trying these things, and there's never a right time to do it, but you might as well do it for this book, and at least you can figure out the best direction that you want to go in. Now, this next set of question is all about story. So I've kind of tried to have each question include an element of plot and character. So this as what your character wants versus what your character needs. I like to think about what they care about, and that can be something that evolves and changes slightly as they get more information, as they get more experience. And I think that's important because your character should evolve and change. Whereas I think thinking about what a character wants and needs, because they're so different, you can, well, I've found in the past that I've picked things that don't have a great relationship to each other, and they can't be easily swapped in and out for each other, because I find that when you are looking at those two aspects, you're kind of saying, well, they want this at the beginning, but what they actually need is like love and friendship or something intangible. Whereas I would prefer to think about a clear goal that they have, the reasons why they want that goal, and then maybe when other things come to light, when everything gets complicated, the nature of what they care about changes, which changes the goal. So I like that question because I think it can talk about an external goal while also relating to the character's inner journey. So I like to think about what the character cares about, how I can mess that up, and how I can decide to give it to them or not quite give it to them, or maybe it changes and I give it to them at the end or something like that. So again, this is all designed for you to brain dump on a page and not necessarily have the most polished, perfect answers. It's just things to be thinking about that you are going to inform your draft. So I kind of touched on this, but another question to think about is, to what extent is your problem answered by the last page? Now, you don't have to have on the last page, it will say this, I know what my final line will be, you know, you don't have to go to that extent. But I think in having this question and forcing yourself to think about the end, as well as everything you thought about with the beginning, you're naturally starting to think about a journey between the two. And whether you are a very diehard pantser or a plantser or a plotter, I just think knowing roughly what you're going to do with an ending, even if it can change, is going to help you have a better sense of how you're going to make things change early on. The reason I include this question is by thinking about the end, even if you change your mind, you are thinking about how everything in your story can change. So you've come up with your premise, you've come up with who your character is, you have decided what maybe problems they're facing, but the nature of the story has to change throughout the story. So by thinking about the ending, thinking about a totally different point B that you're going to reach versus point A is naturally kind of loosening you up, or this is what I find, it loosens me up to help me think about, okay, these are the elements that are going to change, this is what's going to complicate things for the main character, these are things they don't yet know that they're going to find out that's going to change everything. I think this is the point where I jot down a few ideas that end up being my midpoint, that end up being, you know, something that happens in the third act that changes things again and complicates things even further. I know I keep using that word, but it is so important. And these are the ideas that I end up coming back to that feel very close to what the story core is, that just make sense later. Now, if you want to go one step further, or maybe in the past you have struggled with that difficult middle act where everything can get a bit muddy, maybe you lose the thread of the story, I like to think of my book as in two distinct halves. Some people like to use a midpoint twist where everything changes, where something crucial is discovered or something crucial happens that completely flips the story on its head, and that is what they do in the middle, and it means that the beginning of the story and the second half are very different creatures. There's other ways you can think about it, as in like the first half has this rising action that is building tension, building up to a certain moment. Maybe you have an idea of what that scene looks like when they reach the pinnacle of that building up. And then the second half is kind of the sloping down to the resolution. Now, that doesn't mean the pressure or the tension kind of disappears. It just means there is a balance between the first half kind of setting things up and spending most of its time setting things up, and then the second half kind of resolving those things with one way or another. It could be a failure, it could be a defeat, it could be a success, could be a complication, as I keep saying. By thinking of something in the very, very middle that defines what came before it and what came after, can really help you narrow down what it is that you're doing, especially in these early stages. Now, these last questions are all about how you write your draft. The first thing I want you to think about is, how do you work best? So that's to do with your environment. Is there a place that you like to work? Is there a time of day that you like to work? Is there a specific routine that you have in terms of tools that help you focus? So it could be noise cancelling headphones, it could be a specific playlist, it could be, you know, white noise has really worked for me in the past. But also in terms of what motivates you. I've talked about motivation in the past. I have a bit of a strange relationship with motivation. I don't like to think of specific concrete goals. I definitely like action-based goals. So that's me telling myself, if I show up and I do a solid effort, then I have achieved that goal for the day, rather than saying something like it is an outcome-based goal that you have to write 1,000 words a day, because that just doesn't seem to work for me. I think this can be one of those questions that is a little bit trickier to answer, and I think if you are stuck, maybe you've never written a draft before, so you don't know how best you write. If you are struggling to answer this question, maybe you've never written a full-length draft before, I would think about how you get into that flow state and how you find those moments of real concentration and focus, and time slips away, you're just in the zone. And if you really are stuck with that, I would think about examples from your own past where maybe you have studied for exams, or maybe at work you've had a big deadline and you've gotten all the work done in time, just how you work well, and think about how you can create that environment for writing. The next question is, how much space and time am I willing to give to this project? I think this is such a better way of looking at it, rather than setting yourself a goal and saying, right, now I have to do everything in my power to change my life to meet that goal. Especially when goals for, a writer that is not on a publishing schedule, it's quite arbitrary. You can set a goal for anything. And the thing is, everybody's life looks so different that if somebody says it takes them however long to write a draft, you shouldn't assume that that should be the goal that you set for yourself. And I think often it can be really demotivating if you can't reach that. So if you can start off by really thinking about how much space and time can I actually give to this to make it a consistent effort over a long time, because writing a book is a marathon. It's not something you're ever going to be able to achieve in a sprint. I know some people like to binge write, so they might not write for a little while, and then when they get a day, maybe like a quiet Saturday, they will just write all day. And that can really work for some people. It doesn't seem to work so well for me. So what works for me, which is what I've been trying at the moment, is I have 1 hour before work every day where I just sit down and I just do some writing, and I have to show up for that. So that is something that I can tick off if I show up for it and I know I do a good effort, and by the time that the hour ends, I am going off and I'm doing my work. I think that is really good for me, but I do think that other people work so much better in having a word count, or having a timer, or having all these other things. Like maybe you work in the evening, maybe you would work on your lunch break best, who knows. I prefer this question to something like figuring out whether I'm a pantser or a plotter or a gardener or an architect, and all these different words that we use for describing whether you plan extensively before you start writing, or whether you figure out what you're going to do with your story as you are writing. Now, whichever route you take, I think it's important to have grace with yourself and to give yourself the chance to change your mind during the process. A first draft is something that is exploratory. You are telling yourself the story. Ideally, you shouldn't really be sharing it with people, and ideally you shouldn't really stop. You should just keep going. But I've broken both those rules. If you've seen my writing vlogs, you'll have seen that I've broken both those rules. This is just my advice. It's something that I would like to stick to, and I absolutely see the benefits of. Sometimes I have my own reasons for why I break them, but advice is there to be bended, to be taken as you will. This whatever. A first draft is your chance to tell yourself the story and to make decisions that will be changed later on. I do think that while you're drafting, if you do change your mind, the best method I've seen that people use, that I personally really struggle with because I just don't think my brain works that way, but I'm going to share it here in case it's useful to you, is to make a note of the change that you've made in a separate document that you will look at later when you have finished your draft, and then just go ahead assuming that the change has been made in everything that you've written before. So make a note, carry on in this new direction. I find that really difficult because I think that a lot of the changes I make, I need to set it up the right way, and I have that feeling that I need to see how it works on the page before I want to commit to it. So I definitely do a lot of tests, and I do a lot of opening up a new document, blurting it all out, seeing if it works, and sometimes I don't quite know still after I've done that. So my first drafts can look very messy, and they definitely only make sense to me, but that's just the way it is. It doesn't have to make sense to anybody else. You can just do whatever you want. You can have placeholders, you can write it with bullet points, you can just have bits and pieces of dialogue here and there, whatever makes sense to you and you can get from beginning to end is absolutely fine. And that leads me on to my next question, is what do you think this draft is going to look like? And I think this is something that is really important to think about before you set yourself something like a goal or a deadline for getting it finished. If your first draft is going to look very polished, I would assume that you have made a lot of the decisions already, or you can do that thing that I said where you make a note and you can just continue in that direction. I am struggling with that. I am doing that at the moment, and and I'm struggling with it. So what I like to do is I will have parts that I just know are going to be like that, at least for this draft. So I will write it all in prose, and then other sections I don't know. So I will have bullet points, I will go back over them, I will move things around, I'll have placeholders, I'll have bits of dialogue. They're messy, but they're for me, and they're for me to help me write the second draft. It doesn't have to be, you know, perfect. This is the first version of the story. So if there's anything you take away from this, it's to have grace with yourself. It's to allow yourself to make errors or change your mind, whatever you want to call it, and just to figure out how you work best. I think spending time figuring that out and figuring out what you want this draft to look like, what would be useful in helping you write draft 2, will have a much better bearing on how successful you find writing this draft. One thing that I've been thinking about recently that I didn't sort of think about before I started is, what problems do I think I'm going to face writing this draft? What ways am I going to stumble? What ways is it, you know, not going to go to plan? And that is decision making for me. So how can I build into my process solutions to that? You know, how can I address that that's probably going to happen at some point, and what am I going to do when that comes around, so that I don't have a meltdown, so that it just doesn't derail me completely. So for example, now that I know that I like to have a go at testing a bunch of different beginnings, I would go away and do that. I would sort of say, here are the options, here are the pros and cons. I'm going to go away and write a beginning that sets the story up like this. Like, I'm going to make this a real character study, and I have, you know, I'm going to write this in retrospective first person. And then it's going to be another version which is like ensemble cast, and I'm really going to look at the wider implications of this problem and this bigger story that can be told in this world. And I'm going to have these characters, and I'm going to go away and have a go at writing that. And then any other versions that I come up with, and I just think that is what I would set myself as a task before I even say that I'm starting my draft next time. But it could be for you that you allow yourself an extra few weeks, you know, maybe writing a certain number of words, you know, you can predict when you're going to finish, but I would give yourself an extra couple of weeks to allow for those weeks where life gets in the way and you just don't have the time to go and sit down and write. Or, you know, if you struggle with decision making like I do, and you know, you need to see it happening on the page to be able to make that decision, make space in your writing routine to reflect and to think about what you're doing, and then, you know, try and make informed decisions moving forward. If you take anything from this video, it's to have grace with yourself. It's to remember that it is a marathon, not a sprint. It's to really understand what a first draft is and what it means to you. It's helping you get the first version of the story down, and it's helping you write further versions of the story that are much more honed, much more coherent, much more readable for other people, and just looking after yourself as you do it. I think in terms of character and story, it's always thinking about those things in tandem. So how the plot and the character marry together at the beginning, the middle, and the end, why I'm writing the story, what my personal connection is to it, and how I can explore that further in character development, in theme, in setting, in atmosphere, in all these other little ways. So that is all of my questions. Really hope that you can find some of this useful. It's definitely not a clean and tidy process. I have tried to film segments of this video multiple times and had to refilm them because it is difficult to get across in a very clear and concise way, because it's naturally a messy process, and I'm trying to accept that this is a naturally messy process. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I hope you have found something useful in this video, and if you are currently working on a first draft, I would love to hear about it. If you have any tips or tricks as well, you can pop them below. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye!